behold.
Behold.
Which is the Bible word for what in the world? Look at that!
Well, hello there, everyone, and welcome to the Bible Geeks Weekly Podcast. This is episode 72. I'm Brian Shealy.
I'm Ryan Joy.
And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. Last week, we talked about the parables in week 29 of the Into the Book Bible reading program, which means we're in week 30 this week. Matthew chapters 14 through 18. So what's on deck for this episode? What are we talking about?
Well, we're going to find Jesus in some interesting places in those passages, Matthew 14 to 18, and our scripture du jour is in Matthew 17, which is also where we're going to mix it up with a new segment called Here's the Story. And sometimes heaven and earth can feel really far away. Sometimes our life here seems kind of distant from those things that we know are there, but life just gets crazy. And so today we're going to look at a story that shows us where heaven and earth meet. And I'll give you a hint, it's in Jesus. And the story is the transfiguration of Jesus. And I think it's going to be really encouraging and exciting to tell this story together and to just kind of see it come to life, hopefully, and try to envision and imagine what it must have been like to see what Peter and James and John saw.
It feels like a fitting addition to the show after a conversation last week about the power of stories.
Exactly.
So let's tell a story of our own here about Jesus. We'll get into that in a little bit, but before we do, let's find Jesus here in week 30 of the Into the Book Bible reading program, Matthew 14 through 18. So where is Jesus here?
He's all over the place. I found Jesus among his disciples in the world today, actually, in the reading from this week. And it's in Matthew 18 in his discourse. This is the fourth of 5 discourses that the book of Matthew is built around. And this one looks ahead to life in the church of his people, really, this discourse in Matthew 18. And he gives a process for dealing with sin among the church, and then he gives authority here to make judgments, even determining that some brother must be treated as an outsider in verse 17. So let's look at this. I'll read verses 17 to 20. He says, "If he refuses to listen to them," this person who's sinned and people have come to him, he says, "if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them." So there's a lot of ground there, and it seems like maybe disparate, separate ideas in each of those verses, but I really think they're all about this same idea. It's not a verse about prayer and a verse about how many people does it take to make a church, and 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, and a verse about the apostles' authority. I don't think that's what's happening here. He gives this process for dealing with sin, and then he says that if this person at the point that they don't listen to the church, then he says, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. In other words, let him be treated as someone who you don't have fellowship with, who's a pagan, an outsider from the fellowship of God's community. And so what could possibly give believers on earth, especially after the apostles are gone, such authority? And he says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. In other words, our teacher remains present with us, and his saints have this measure of delegated authority. So he says, as you bind, it'll be bound, and as you loose, it'll be loosed, or more literally, it has been bound in heaven. It has been loosed. You're not making new rules, but you're applying these things that are bound in heaven, and you're making judgments and considerations, and not individually, not one person is doing this, but this community of the church that has Jesus with us are making these considerations. Why? Because we're carrying his name. As much as we are acting in his name, within his will, within his authority and his precepts, we carry his name and his authority. And so I think it's interesting that he says not just one person that's rashly throwing out their judgments and expecting it to be accepted, but when the group of believers prayerfully agrees and acts within his authority, Christ stands with them. So it's kind of cool in these stories of the gospel where Jesus is living all of these moments and these stories to see a time when Jesus is projecting into the life of the church, and we find Jesus there as well. Emmanuel, God with us.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me how he says, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. He's not demonizing necessarily or like calling Gentiles and tax collectors like evil people, because clearly he had plenty of interactions with Gentiles and tax collectors.
Right.
But the general sentiment, I think he's acknowledging that you treat these kinds of people in certain ways, and that's how seriously you need to treat someone who used to be close to you and now has gone astray and won't come back. And it's a serious thing that he's calling us to do, which is why, like you said, why I think he's basically saying, I'm with you while you're doing this. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged in this. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you said about especially going to stand for right amongst those who are fallen and in need of some help. And really, that's the context here, as we see in the story right before it, in verses 10 to 14, the story of the sheep, the lost sheep who is out there, and the Lord leaves the 99, the shepherd leaves the 99 to go and get the one who's astray, and that leads right into this idea of your brother sinning against you, and you go and tell him his fault, not because he needs to be told he's wrong, though he does, but the point is you need to go and bring the lost sheep in, just like the Lord has gone to find him, that lost sheep, and bring it in.
So I'll give you a secret. My finding Jesus is in those verses, Matthew chapter 18, verses 10 to 14.
No, I knew that. That was my transition. What are you talking about?
That's a hefty transition there, sir. So I found Jesus, as we've kind of talked about a little bit, as the one who loves even the lost one. So here, just backing up a little bit, in verses 10 to 14 of Matthew 18, he says, see that you do not despise one of these little ones. Of all the little ones, of all the children of his, don't even despise one. It says, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. I have to say, I've heard this verse thrown around a lot lately in our current society and in a lot of the issues that are going on. And Jesus here is concerned about the 1%, meaning he's concerned about the one out of the whole group who needs the most attention. And this is all, as if you go all the way back, this is all in response to somebody who asked the question, who is the greatest? And so this is one of the parables that Jesus gives to answer that question. But the lost sheep really do matter to Jesus. It's not about just let them go. We didn't need them anyway. They weren't important anyway. Just focus on the 99. And the one sheep matters. It doesn't mean that the 99 matter less, but the 99 are safe and they're fine. And they're doing okay. But there's one sheep here who needs attention. And Jesus is saying, look, that one who is out there and needs attention is the one I'm going to give attention to. And the 99 can deal with it while I'm gone. And when I come back, then all of the sheep will be cared for together equally. But that immediate danger, I think, is so telling that Jesus really cares about that. He was invested in this. And the fact that he says, my Father doesn't want one of these little ones to perish, it really just highlights in my mind how we have this kind of conservative phrase that we use that we're pro-life. And does that extend to all areas of our lives? Does that extend to every person that we interact with? Does every person's life matter, even the ones who need our help so much? And Jesus here cares about every single little one of them. And if one of them has trouble, he's going to risk those 99 and go help that one. And I just think for myself, I am a middle-class white male in America, and I have probably never experienced some of the injustices and some of the difficulties and struggles that a lot of other people have. And those people need a help up. They need somebody to go after them and help them and take care of them. And I know that's not specifically, the social justice kind of issues that Jesus is dealing with here, but spiritually speaking, I need to be looking for every opportunity to save somebody and to help somebody who's lost, rather than just writing off certain people and saying, I don't need to care about them or think about them or consider them.
Yeah, it was kind of shocking to me, even though I've read all of this before, to read again this week the story of the Canaanite woman. Mm-hmm. And to read the story of Jesus going to Tyre and Sidon, and these cities that were great metropolitan areas, but places that the Jews probably wouldn't want to really have a lot of interaction like Jesus does with all of these outsiders. I mean, these are the people that they would not want to spend a lot of time with, yet Jesus goes to them. He heals them. He teaches them. He feeds them. It seems that that's still part of he eats with them, that's right. Part of the story of the second feeding of the thousands there. And so, I think there is this sense of inclusiveness to Jesus that is certainly not the kind of thing, the focus that Jesus has is different than just to be inclusive for inclusiveness' sake. Yeah. But that is a starting point for trying to include all of God's lost sheep, all of God's sheep in the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into our next segment here, which is Scripture du jour.
What is the soup du jour?
It's the soup of the day.
That sounds good. I'll have that.
So we're in Matthew 17, and what out of this chapter really stands out at you? Don't get into the first part of it. We've still got that to go.
I'll be honest. I started out, I was thinking maybe I'll just go ahead and do one of those verses. And then I was going to do the verse that you actually chose. And I started looking at that, and then I thought, okay, he's got that one. So there's another verse here that I think is really interesting, really cool. It's verse 20, and it might be familiar to people. It says, he said to them, "Because of your little faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." So the story here is there's this man who has a boy that he wants healed, a demon cast out of him, and the disciples weren't able to do it. And he says here, it's because of your little faith. It's an interesting phrase. It's actually in Greek one compound word, little faith. And their little faith is the problem, but interestingly, it only takes a mustard seed-sized faith to move a mountain. So either their faith is super small, or more likely, I think to me, their problem is in the quality of their faith, not the quantity.
Right.
Looking at the 4 other times Jesus used this word in Matthew, this is a favorite word of Matthew's, I get the sense that it's a small kind of faith, kind of a halfway uncommitted kind of faith. So let me just run through the other 4 times this word, little faith, and I say it like it's one word because it is in the Greek. This word little faith or small faith is used in Matthew chapter 6, verse 30, in the Sermon on the Mount, and in that famous passage about anxiety and worry, Jesus says that the little faith person worries about their clothes, although God provides for lilies. Mm-hmm. And then in 8 verse 26, we find this fear that the disciples have. These disciples are worried that the sea would kill them, because they're out on a boat. Even though Jesus is with them, asleep in the same boat, they're afraid. And Jesus says, you have little faith. And then in chapter 14, verse 31, they're overwhelmed with panic. We see Peter worrying that he'll sink, although Jesus is right in front of him, and he says, "You of little faith, I'm right here. I'm going to help you." And then in chapter 16, verse 8, there's that story where Jesus has just done the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, and Jesus says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." And the disciples start talking about, I don't know. I don't think we have any bread. He's going to want bread. We don't have bread. He's going to expect something of us we can't deliver. And it's like they've forgotten, first of all, that he can make bread magically appear, and secondly, that he wasn't even talking about bread. And so this confused stress they have there, he says, "You of little faith."
So you're saying anxiety, fear, panic, and stress
are all the characteristics of little faith.
Yeah, it sounds like today, right?
Yeah, sounds like me some of the time when I have little faith.
Exactly.
So I think the lesson that I take from this is that it doesn't take mighty, massive quantities of faith. It just takes real faith. It takes us not getting overwhelmed by our present situation, whether that's needing clothes or being scared of the sea or whatever stress and anxiety and panic comes over you today, but not letting all of those things and those problems and those material concerns have more weight than the power and presence and providence of the Lord. We have something other than genuine effective faith whenever that stuff starts to really turn the scales and weigh more than what the Lord is able to do for us. So we need to put single-minded trust in the Lord, and even if we do that just a little, it has significance and effectiveness if it's real confidence kind of pushing our lot in wholly with Jesus.
It seems a whole lot like big faith is demonstrated in little actions, because all those interactions that you talked about there, they were all, fairly minor things in the grand scheme of things. Mm-hmm. And I do feel like sometimes we get this mentality that I have to demonstrate my faith in really grandiose, big ways. But big faith is demonstrated in small, everyday, moment-to-moment interactions when we just trust that things are going to be fine.
Exactly. Yeah. In a way, it seems like faith is binary. It's there are times when I don't have faith.
Yeah.
Where really even unbelief takes hold in me. But even whenever I'm throwing a prayer to God, like that guy that says to Jesus, "I believe, Lord, help my unbelief." Mm-hmm. Even when I'm there and I'm saying, "Okay, I'm with you. I'm going to step out with you and walk with you," I don't think I believe enough. I think that I have so many problems and I'm not sure about so many things, but I'm just going to trust you on this, and I'm going to walk with you in this thing that you've said I need to do. That is faith.
Yeah.
So where did you find something interesting in Matthew chapter 17?
Yeah, so verse 24 through 27, this is where they come into Capernaum, and the collectors of this 2 drachma tax went up to Peter, and they start talking to him. And they say, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And he said, "From others." Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea, and cast in a hook, and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." Aside from the amazing miracle of the fish with a shekel in its mouth, I think the thing that stands out at me here is how Jesus is basically saying, look, I know that I am not obligated to pay this tax, but I'm going to do it anyway for a specific reason. And what a great example of Jesus showing balance and thoughtfulness in his approach. Like, if you envision this pendulum swinging from one end to the other, sometimes we swing to, I'm going to demand my rights, and this is right, and I'm just going to do what I feel is right. And then on the other hand, we just sometimes maybe go too far the other direction, where we try to be people pleasers, and we try to never offend anyone and never do anything that might stand out. But Jesus is finding the perfect balance here. He's acknowledging that he doesn't have to pay this tax, but on the other hand, if he doesn't pay it, then he's going to offend people. And he's going to offend them for no reason. Like, Jesus is not afraid of offending people. He does that plenty of times. But is tax paying a hill that Jesus wants to die on, so to speak? And that's not where his battle is. Jesus' battle is not in paying taxes. He doesn't want to be known as a political rebel. He wants to be known as somebody who teaches the truth and is the Son of God on this earth. But in order to make sure that he does not offend people for silly, petty, unnecessary reasons, he takes care of this and pays the tax anyway. And it kind of reminds me of Paul when he decides to circumcise Timothy, but when it comes to Titus, he doesn't circumcise Titus. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is because of the audience and the impact that it's going to have. On one hand, Timothy would have been hindered in his work if he hadn't been, but Titus, if he was, that would have undercut what Paul was really trying to teach these people. And so I guess it's just a constant reminder for me, like, what hill do I really want to die on? Like, what battle do I really want to pick? And sometimes if my influence is going to be diminished because of my choices, and I don't need to worry about those choices, even though I might be right in making those choices, just let it go and move on to the things that are really important. And Jesus shows us that here.
There are so many applications of that to exactly this moment, and I think that's such a great little capsule, little moment in time where Jesus brilliantly shows that discernment you're talking about between when offense is exactly what everyone needs and when you just aren't going to get anything from giving offense to people. And it really is, like you brought up Paul, it really is a moment of Jesus giving up his rights. It is an issue of liberties, because this is a liberty that no one else has, but because Jesus is Jesus, he doesn't need to pay a temple tax. Because he is the Son, and sons are exempt from tax. He's the Son of God, and so he doesn't need it, but he doesn't need to prove that with this moment. Right. He can just give up that right very easily, and this shekel that Peter finds that's worth 4 drachmas. That coincidentally is exactly the amount that the temple tax was that every Jewish male had to pay. So how about that? So Jesus just takes care of it, lets Peter pay the tax voluntarily, and makes everything go smoothly in that way, unlike so many other things that are going to happen to Jesus, because everybody's offended by him, it seems, at some point.
All right, so let's get into our last segment, and it's a new segment, and it's called Here's the Story.
Here's the story.
So we're going to tell a story, and it's from the beginning of Matthew chapter 17, and it's about the Transfiguration, and this is a pretty awesome story, and so we figured we'd just focus on it. So let's set the stage for the story, and we'll get right into it.
I feel like I should say once upon a time, but this is a true story, and that probably wasn't...
In a galaxy far, far away.
Yes. Oh, I love it. A long time ago, on a hill in Galilee... A week after Jesus' stunning announcement that he will suffer and die at the hands of the Jerusalem leaders, he takes 3 of his close friends up a mountain. This could be Mount Tabor or Mount Hermon. People aren't quite sure where it was, but they went by themselves. As they go, they could look back at Galilee and enjoy that picturesque view of God's creation, of the Promised Land. But more importantly, they could find quiet room to pray and reflect. And that's what Luke 9:28 says they're going up to do.
It seems to me that this time to be alone and by themselves doesn't happen very often. And they're getting this time to be together, just the 4 of them up on the mountain.
Yeah, and you wonder just what Jesus had in his mind as they walk up that mountain, what he is reflecting on. Is he aware of what is going to happen? I'm sure he is. Is he going to initiate that conversation? Is he thinking about how Peter and James and John are going to respond as he brings them up to witness it?
Yeah, there's been a lot of exciting things that happen on the way up to a mountain. I'm thinking about Abraham and just that expectation of the amazing events that are going to occur up there. But I don't think Peter, James, and John really have any idea what they're expecting. I'm fully aware that Jesus knows exactly what's about to happen. But these disciples, who are probably the closest to Jesus, are going to witness some amazing things, but they don't have a single clue as to what's going to happen. And so in verse 2 of this story, when he was transfigured before them, and that's what happens here. They watch Jesus' transfiguration. And this is not a word that is commonly used in the Bible. It's used in a few places, but this word in the Greek is the word for metamorphosis, like thinking of a caterpillar or a butterfly, that kind of change. Like whatever is going to happen to Jesus, whatever happens to him on this mountain is unique and is very different from what you would normally see in the face of Jesus' humanity. But it goes on here, and it talks about how his face shines like the sun and his clothes go pure white. I mean, I'm a white boy myself. My face has never shone like the sun.
You're white, but not that white.
I'm white, but not that white. And my face has never shone like the sun like this. But you see this picture of Jesus shining there on the mountain. And you kind of throw back, I think, to Moses in the book of Exodus in chapter 34, as he comes down from talking to God and his face is shining and the people they can't handle it. Now Jesus is shining before his closest apostles, and that's a pretty amazing thing. I don't know what I would feel like if I was watching this. How would I even respond to this great teacher that I was learning about and seeing him perform all these amazing miracles? Like, how would I view him when now he changes before my eyes into something amazing and pure? But it gets better. It's not just about Jesus shining right before their eyes on the mountain.
Yeah, because suddenly Jesus isn't alone. The word that Matthew uses here in our translation is behold.
Behold.
Which is the Bible word for what in the world? Look at that. And yeah, I mean, already Jesus' face is shining. He's glorious. It's like heaven has pierced a hole. It's like the glory that he's been concealing in this common flesh that he's walking around in can't be contained in that moment. It's just shining out. And then behold, Moses and Elijah appeared. I like that word, appeared. It's like they were teleported in Star Trek style from above. They just appear from wherever they came from. I don't know if the disciples immediately recognized them. Did Moses have that Charlton Heston-like robe and beards? Did Elijah wear his hair garment and his leather belt? I have so many questions about what they're thinking, what's happening, but we do get a bit more information. We learned that they were talking. I think that's so cool.
What were they talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we actually know that. And I think that that's really cool. We see these two great figures from the Old Testament there with the greatest figure ever. There's Moses, a meek and virtuous man in his own right. He's representing God's revelation to Israel on that other mountain way back in the day, Mount Sinai. And he's representing the first part of the Bible. He's representing the law that he wrote. And because then you've got Elijah, kind of like the second witness there, who is the icon of prophecy, the one John was compared to, who kind of represents all the other prophets and all their testimony throughout the Old Testament. So it's kind of like the Old Testament personified in these two guys.
The law and the prophets talking to the Messiah.
Exactly, talking to the Messiah. And they're all mighty miracle workers, but what did they do? They, just like we're doing right now, in a way, they sat down and they talked. They had this conversation about the future and the world and the will of God. We call it chewing the fat or solving the world's problems over coffee. But this was a meeting of the minds where Jesus finally had somebody who he could engage with at a higher level than thick-skulled disciples like us who are just trying to make sense of it all. And he engages with them about a very particular topic. And Luke tells us what they're talking about. In fact, he uses an interesting word to describe the topic of their conversation. It says they talked about Jesus' Exodus. Mm-hmm. And translation, good translation, usually says Jesus' departure, which is what Exodus means in Greek. But of course, Exodus is an important word. It's the name in the Septuagint of the book of Exodus, and it's the word for the great departure from Egypt across the Red Sea, where God's people were redeemed and became his people, really. And I think that word is chosen very carefully by Luke and really describes this conversation with Moses, who experienced the Exodus, and with Elijah as they talk about this new work of redemption and deliverance that God is doing. So they discuss Jesus' death and maybe what it meant. I mean, to be a rock sitting on that hill. And of course, James and Peter and John were on that hill.
Yeah.
Listening to them talk.
Well, and it would have been a sleepy rock too, because if you go to Luke's account, Luke talks about it being the nighttime, which, I mean, makes sense. If you're going to shine like the face of the sun, you might as well do it at night. And it seems really, I don't know, just an amazing picture to wake up and see this sight in front of you. Like these three figures who are just so deeply important to you.
Really. I mean, just like there are some conversations. My daughter, Anna, loves to play this game. If you could, and then she imagines a scenario, if you could go to any place and time, where would you go? And sometimes she'll say, okay, name 10 places and times that you want to go to. This has got to be in the top 10 list, I think, for me. I think I would love to just sit there. I want to be invisible. I think I don't want to be engaged with any of these people that I'm totally in awe of. James and John and Peter too, just like because of all the things they've gone through. I know they're just men, but just to sit there and see that would be so cool.
I think Peter would agree with you after the fact. But as he's standing there, he is starstruck, I think.
Yeah.
And what would you do? You would probably be falling all over yourself. I don't know if you've ever met a celebrity or ever had an opportunity to speak to somebody who you viewed as like really super important. I have on occasion, and I think just about every time I've said something dumb, or I've shoved my foot in my mouth, or I've just gotten so nervous that it was like I should have just kept my mouth shut. And I think that's probably what Peter's is feeling like after this whole thing, because he jumps out there and he's seeing their little company that they went up to the mountain with growing in number. And his first reaction, I think, is from a really good place. I think he's trying to show these really important people hospitality. Mm-hmm. He wants to build them tents. It's the nighttime. Why don't we set up some tents for Moses? Why don't we set up some tents for Elijah, and they can all stay with us? And I think we kind of give Peter maybe a hard time sometimes because of what God is about to say, but I think Peter is doing a really good thing, and he's probably making the best possible choice he knows how to make in the moment, which is, let's show these two people some hospitality. So then Peter gets an earful from God. Well, I guess all of them really hear what God really wants them to know from this whole interaction.
Yeah, and I've been interrupted before, and it's always unsettling because you just, as you sort your train of thought out and you try
I've never interrupted you before, have I?
Never. I've probably interrupted you at least triple the amount of times you've interrupted me, but it's hard, right? Because, I mean, and my family are interrupters. We just jump in, you get your in as soon as somebody is like pausing to take a breath, and you talk. But imagine mid-sentence being interrupted by God's booming voice from heaven. Peter's in the middle of his speech. It's good for us to be here. How can I help you? Why don't we build these things? I've got this great idea. And it says in Matthew, he was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." I imagine one of those billowy silver clouds that you see coming out when the sun is breaking in after a storm. But this bright cloud overshadowed them. and it powerfully represented a presence beyond the clouds. You think about back when Moses was on the mountain, and in Exodus 19:9 it says, "In a thick cloud I'm going to come to you, that the people may hear when I speak with you and may also believe you forever." I think that's really cool. And eventually that's what's going to happen here. That same effect, as we'll talk about later. Peter's going to remember this forever. These three men, and many of us who have heard this story from their lips long ago, and now us from their pens, will believe in him forever because of these moments, stories like this about his glory. But in that moment, that was not an experience of glorious joy. It was pure terror.
Yep.
They fell to the ground, probably a move of both humble awe and panicked self-preservation. Get down, get on the ground, their faces down, and they realize exactly what's going on. I mean, they know, they've heard the stories, and now they see this with their own eyes, and they hear God declare, "This is my son." And then it comes with an instruction, and an instruction we would all do well to hear. Listen to him.
So their reaction, though, it reminds me a whole lot of the beginning of the book of Revelation. Because you've got John there falling at his feet as though dead. And then the words that Jesus says to him are exactly the same tone of the words that he says to them here.
Oh, that's interesting.
Fear not.
That same John.
Yeah. So you put yourself in John's shoes, and John has seen this here in this case, and he's about to see it later on in his life when he has that vision in Revelation.
Yeah. Rise and have no fear. and he touched them.
Yes, that's the
so
biggest
cool.
thing.
Yeah.
I love that. He's so compassionate here. He doesn't get after them. He doesn't talk about their small faith. He doesn't poke them in the eye for proposing that they would lift up Moses or Elijah. He just says, get up and don't be afraid after touching them. And he's there with them. He's connecting with them. And this is, again, kind of like earlier when they saw him walking on the water and they thought it was a ghost out there. And Jesus from the water says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And I think Jesus' big message and that little faith that we talked about earlier,
yeah,
we have to have big faith. And big faith comes and just annihilates fear. Like there's no way to have fear when we have big faith. And now I'm saying it like that, big faith instead of little faith.
Big faith, not little faith.
So they lift up their eyes after Jesus touches them, after he tells them not to be afraid. And like some scene out of a movie somewhere, everything is just back to normal, the way that it was. No Moses, no Elijah, and Jesus is there before them. It appears in the form that they had went up on the mountain with him. And it's a good thing that Jesus brought the three of them, I think, because I don't know that any one of them would have believed their own eyes with what they saw. And each of them were probably looking at each other like, do you understand what just happened? Like, what just occurred?
Yeah, and that moment, that shift really encapsulates so much of the mystery of Jesus, just the strangeness of God among us as a regular old normal guy. In some ways, you just look at him, you touch him, he looks like a person, he lives, he hurts, he eats, and yet he's not a regular guy. And every once in a while, you start to see just how not regular he is. And there's this interesting contrast between that moment where he was glowing and God is declaring who he is, and has Moses and Elijah on left and right, and the moment when his glory is truly revealed on the cross, when he looks most humiliated and most human, and on his left and his right are criminals. There's such a contrast, and just that moment of, like we were talking at the beginning about heaven and earth and how far away they seem, and yet then there's Jesus reaching down and looking like Jesus and putting his hand on Peter's shoulder and saying, don't fear, it's okay. It's just such a cool thing. And after a special moment, what do you want to do? Even coming home from a great ball game, or some just a movie, just something great. Whenever you experience something together, you want to talk about it. Certainly something more significant, coming home from a baptism or a wedding or a funeral or something big that happens in your life. You often travel in a mix of like meditative silence and then these excited flurries of conversation. What did that mean? Can you believe he said that? And in this case, they say, why did the scribes say that first Elijah must come? We just saw Elijah. Is that what they were talking about? What was happening there? How does this fit into the prophecies? And as they walk down the mountain, Jesus tells the three friends, keep this day to yourselves for now until he raises from the dead. And then he explains that Elijah has come, but people didn't see who he was and they killed him. And in the same way, Jesus will suffer at their hands, at the hands of these people who killed Elijah. And as Jesus finishes explaining it, the light bulb goes on and they realize, John the Baptist is the Elijah that Scripture prophesied. And so they start to get it, and they're putting these pieces together and having this moment on the way back from the truly spectacular moment that they just experienced.
And that's how we started out the week in Matthew 14. That story of John the Baptist being executed, really. And we didn't talk about it on the episode, but Jesus here is throwing back to that, telling them all about how John the Baptist was treated, and that's a foreshadowing of how he's going to be treated. And at least, to their credit, at least they're starting to make these connections. Yeah,
that's interesting what you bring up about not long before that, Jesus dealing with his own grief about John's execution. So he's not just talking about it abstractly, like interpreting the prophets. Right. Well, here's what was happening, but he's explaining this is the consequence of a prophet, an Elijah standing amongst these people. And the Pharisees, the scribes, the religious leaders are doing this to them. The same thing is going to happen to me.
Yeah, well, you talked about them talking about it and having this conversation, but one of the things that Jesus tells them here is tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty good at keeping secrets, but I'm pretty sure that if I saw something like this, sorry, Jesus, I'm going to tell as many people as I can.
I'll just whisper
it. Would be really hard to not tell other people this, but Jesus tells them to keep it a secret, and apparently they do, and to their credit here. But I can't imagine being Peter, carrying this in the back of my mind for all this time, and then finally, like a treasure that you've been carrying around in a time capsule, being able to open this up and tell people, like he does in his second letter in chapter 1, verses 16 to 18. He's convincing the people there that, look, we're not people who are just gullible. We're not following these cleverly devised myths, when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. And then he talks about this event, the Transfiguration, when he says that he heard the voice that was borne to him by the majestic glory, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." And that is like, he has now this tool in his toolbox. Like, let me tell you what I saw. It's a pretty amazing story, the story of the Transfiguration, and just another example of at least Matthew's writing to put Jesus as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets and to establish him in his kingship. And you can't help but see those points coming out of this story. And putting yourself in Peter's shoes, James' shoes, John's shoes, if you were there, like, what would this have looked like? And how would it have shaped your teaching and the way that you continued bringing the message of Jesus out into the world?
Yeah, these moments, we have to practice reading them with some kind of a sanctified imagination, to go back to what we talked about last week a little bit. Just letting these things come to life because they're told in a way that should light up our excitement, our imagination, and help us envision what it must have been like. And this was as real as whatever happened to you today. Peter saw this stuff, and James heard the voice of God, and it's really amazing. And that was fun. That was fun telling that story.
We'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into a challenge this week. And maybe a good challenge from some of the stuff we talked about a little earlier in the episode. Find a way to look out for that lost sheep this week. Maybe that 1%, the 1 out of the 99. Find a way to look out for somebody who you may have never considered before. Because as much as we look around at the world and think that we just need to mind our own business and focus on our own stuff, God doesn't want any one of these lost ones to be lost.
It's a challenging challenge. I'll have to be thinking about that and working on that this week.
Those are good challenges. Challenging challenges.
Challenging challenges.
I dig it. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning into the Bible Geeks podcast. You can find us on our website at BibleGeeks.fm. You can find show notes for this episode at BibleGeeks.fm/72. You want to get in touch with us, find out how to support the show, go to BibleGeeks.fm/contact. And if you want to follow along with the Into the Book Bible reading program, it's online, BibleGeeks.fm/Into the Book. We're currently in week 30. Next week, we'll be in week 31. That's how it works. So until next week, everyone, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
Shalom.